Born in Kumasi in 1938, Kofi Annan studied at the Mfantsipim Secondary School before enrolling at the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology. He received a Ford Foundation grant enabling him to complete his undergraduate studies in economics and international relations at the McAllister College, St. Paul, Minnesota, United States in 1961. He joined the UN in 1962, working for the World Health Organization's Geneva office. He went on to work in several capacities at the UN headquarters, including serving as the Under-Secretary General for peacekeeping duties. He was appointed as Secretary General on 13 December 1996 by the Security Council and later confirmed by the General Assembly, making him the first office holder to be elected from the UN staff itself. As the Secretary General, Kofi Annan reformed the UN bureaucracy, worked to combat HIV, especially in Africa, and launched the UN Global Compact. He was criticized for not expanding the Security Council and faced calls for his resignation after an investigation into the Oil for Food program. After leaving the UN, he founded the Kofi Annan Foundation in 2007 to work on international development. He was a co-recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. Tributes started pouring in when news of his death became public. President Akufo-Addo described him as a consummate international diplomat who was highly respected. The United Kingdom Prime Minister Theresa May described Mr. Annan as a great leader and reformer who made a huge contribution to the world, while the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi described him as a conscience keeper of international peace and security.
Yeah, Elton John Broby there, putting it all in one report. Of course, the news broke on Saturday that the former United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan had died, and this great Ghanaian died in a hospital in Switzerland Saturday morning after a short illness. He was 80 years old. Now today on this show we're going to speak to people who worked closely with him. One of them is here with me. He's Dr. Joseph Samuel Annan, Senior Policy Advisor at the UN for several years in New York, before he then came home and became a member of Parliament for Commander Edna Eguafu Ebrim constituency. Also under Professor Mills, he was a Deputy Minister for Education as well as Trade and Industry. How nice to see you. Thank you so much for coming, Mr. Annan, or Dr. Annan, forgive me. And I wish the circumstances were better, but unfortunately it's at this great loss that we are compelled to meet. But I'm looking forward to learning about him through your experience of him. When did you first get to know Kofi Annan?
Actually, I only met Kofi Annan for the first time in Abuja in 2001 when there was a very large conference on trying to set up the Global Fund for AIDS, tuberculosis and malaria, for HIV. It was an international conference that had all the leaders, current leaders in Africa and former leaders. It was attended by Bill Clinton and former President Kufuor and Jerry Rawlings. And that was the time when he pushed to have the Global Fund for AIDS, tuberculosis. It was the beginnings of that, but there was a time when we were pushing for the Millennium Development Goals. And of course, Goal 6 was to combat HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis and malaria.
What was your impression of him at that first meeting?
Well, my first impression, of course, one had had impressions of him through the media. But it was that of a towering statesman who was extremely soft-spoken, but had fire in his eyes and determination. And you knew that as a Secretary General, he was a general first and a secretary second.
Wow, a great description. And of course, over the years, because you yourself were at the UN, no doubt you intersected, your work intersected with his, I can imagine. Tell me, as a Secretary General, the position that brought him to the attention of the world, how did he function? What was his philosophy for going about that all-important job?
Let me underscore that, I worked mostly with UNDP. We were largely responsible for crafting the Millennium Development Goals and trying to implement them and monitor them over the years. And so it wasn't that I worked on a daily basis with him, far from it. But what we knew about him was quite often we'd supply his secretariat with some of the information that needed to come out. But and the interactions and the personal interactions that we had, he was clearly a person that required, would command presence always. And I would say that in his ability to make people feel welcome and exuded strength, I would say. And clearly, he made everybody feel very proud of being on his team.
Now, the news of his death hit everyone hard. I wonder what your first thoughts were when you heard the news.
I actually heard the news quite late on Saturday because I had been up in the mountains a little bit incommunicado. It was a shock because I had only fairly recently seen an interview on his 80th birthday where he jokingly said that he would continue working as long as his wife Nanny would allow him to, but that he was fit and was going to continue. So we all expected many more years with him as a world figure and as a global leader for Africa.
Yes, life, even though at the age of 80, certainly sort of cut short earlier than anyone expected. Now, this is a picture that you brought with you, isn't it? This picture that we're showing on the screen right now.
Oh, yeah, this is just a personal family moment. This was in New York at the time when my former wife's family and ourselves were invited to lunch with him. And as you can see in the forefront, this was about 2004, that's my son, who's also called Kofi Annan.
Oh, wow.
And so him and the Secretary General had a wonderful banter where he was saying, no, I'm Kofi Annan. I said, no, but I'm Kofi Annan. And so the two exchanged some very interesting, because in fact in the end my son was saying, but this is my house then, because if you're Kofi Annan, this is my house. But yes. But one of the things that in your report, for example, that came out, I wanted to get a sense. You asked me what I felt after the news, and I quickly monitored the international media and stuff. And the first day, of course, it was a lot. But strangely enough, in the second day, it was very little. For such a towering figure, I expected, because I even remember not so long ago with the passing of Barbara Bush, Bush's senior's wife. It was in the media for quite some, the mainstream media for quite some time. And my sense is that, although we've had a lot of tributes, his greatness is really underscored by the tributes from all sides. It's a kind of his death is not lost in the sense that it's a unifying force, because you've had people who fought him like Tony Blair singing his praises. Putin is also added, and of course here in Ghana, from all sides of the aisle, we've had very glowing tributes that really make it clear that in fact his legacy and the history that he's laid down for us will be great. But I just wanted to say that one of the reasons I was keen to sort of come here, and myself and other colleagues are keen, that we want the international world to also not make his life a one-day wonder, that his legacy is preserved. That's why I was a little concerned when the next days after his passing, I scanned the international media and there was very little.
Now let's talk about that life. There are some who suggest that actually his best work came after his term at the UN as Secretary General, and that his intervention in international conflicts and his pursuit of peace and his advocacy and even his availability as a mentor and a role model, those are the more impactful things, and they all came after his term as Secretary General. I wonder what your impression is of that opinion.
I think if we take it from the beginning, Kofi Annan became Secretary General at an extremely difficult time in global geopolitics. It was a time where we had crept into a unipolar world. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and his predecessor, Boutros Ghali, who was also an excellent intellectual, quickly fell out with the powers that be. And as a result, his term in office was cut short. So the initial reaction from even some African senior members, politicians, is, oh, this man Kofi Annan has been in the UN for so many decades. He's likely to become a stooge of the international powers that be, mostly the permanent members of the Security Council. So I remember clearly, discussions that really downgraded him in the beginning. But immediately he got into office, that quiet determination I referred to early on, sometimes even when he spoke you could hardly hear him, was clear that it was going to change the world. Because through this quiet diplomacy, he managed to navigate some very, very difficult times. And if you say that his best work came after, his work after being Secretary General, of course, was extremely important. But if we look at Sierra Leone, Liberia, East Timor, the independence for East Timor, for example, was a great thing. And the fact that, I'm sure you're aware of the fact that when Bush #2 invaded Iraq, Kofi Annan was put under a lot of pressure.
Yes.
And I don't think, probably since Dag Hammarskjöld in the 60s, a Secretary General has been put under such pressure. Into the extent, of course, the oil for food, investigating right down to anybody and anything that was connected. I will even mention this, that I didn't know Kofi Annan before I joined the UN. But I got a call, a certain senior colleague called me that I was being investigated at the time because of my name.
Yes.
So it went quite far, stretched right into the realms of anything that could, and yet he managed to stay steadfast in his second term and go through this. So this is before we talk about what I personally worked with, which is the MDGs and the Global Fund for AIDS, Tuberculosis and Malaria, which are great legacies of bringing, his philosophy, which was there is no security without development, and there's no development without security.
Wonderful. And, I wish we could go on and on, but I'm going to ask you to wrap up with your thoughts on what his legacy is, to the world, to Ghana, and perhaps to you personally.
Well, let me tell you a story. I was once in faraway Tehran, and the taxi driver that picked me up, we couldn't speak each other's language. And he said, "You come from," I said, "Oh, Ghana." And when I said Ghana, he mentioned, Kofi Annan, president of the world.
Oh.
And that was the dream, in a sense. I think that his legacy, for me, represents the type of person, the type of intellect, the type of determination or commitment that one day, if we have a unified world, we would have a president of the world. Somebody who represents not only his country, not only his continent, Africa, but indeed the whole world, where even taxi drivers in Tehran will hail him as their president.
What a beautiful image to end this conversation on. Dr. Joseph Annan, thank you so much for your time with us. Thank you for showing us Kofi Annan through your eyes. We appreciate it ever so much.